Hello, everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was one of those quiet afternoons where time seemed to slow down, stretching out in front of me like a long, lazy afternoon. The kind of day where you could feel the hours pass without truly noticing them. I had just finished my shift at the small bookstore I worked at, the kind of place that felt like home. The worn wooden shelves, the smell of coffee and books, and the soft murmur of customers flipping through pages. It was always peaceful. As I stepped out into the street, the air was cool, the kind of crisp breeze that signaled the onset of fall. I had no particular place to be, so I wandered aimlessly, letting my thoughts drift as I walked. I passed familiar streets, the cafes I always frequented, the quiet park with its old oak tree. It was all as it should be, or so I thought. I was approaching the park when I saw her. She was standing by the bench near the large oak tree, her back to me, looking out at the small pond that sat in the middle of the park. I knew her. I knew her face, her walk, the way she carried herself. But it was strange. She wasn't someone I saw every day, not even someone I spoke to regularly. She was just someone I knew in passing, someone whose presence had been in the background of my life for as long as I could remember. There was something in the way she stood there that made me pause. She wasn't doing anything, just standing, but there was a stillness about her, as if she was waiting for something. Something in her posture, a quiet resignation or maybe anticipation, struck me. I couldn't quite place it, but I felt drawn to her. I walked toward her slowly, unsure of what I would say when I reached her. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe even longer, but somehow this felt like a moment that needed to be seized. I stepped closer, trying to think of the words, but before I could say anything, she turned around. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment she smiled. It wasn't a wide smile, but a soft one, full of familiarity. A smile like we were old friends, though we hadn't shared any real moments in years. "Hi," she said, her voice soft but clear. I smiled back, relieved to hear her voice, though a small part of me felt that strange pull in the pit of my stomach, the one that warned me something wasn't quite right. She waved gently as if to signal a quiet goodbye. But before I could respond, before I could ask where she was going or what had brought her here, she turned and walked away. It wasn't hurried. She walked slowly with purpose, and I couldn't help but watch her, still unsure of what to say. I thought about calling her name, but for some reason I didn't. The moment felt too fragile, like if I spoke too loudly it might break. I stood there, watching her walk down the path, her figure growing smaller and smaller as she moved further away. I told myself I would catch up with her, ask her about life, about how she'd been, but somehow my legs felt heavy, and the words felt stuck in my throat. And then, as I stood there, rooted to the spot, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I turned to look around, the quiet of the park settling in once more. But when I turned back, she was gone. Completely gone. The path she had walked down was empty. The spot by the bench where she had stood now, nothing more than an empty patch of grass. It was as if she had never been there at all. I blinked, certain that I had seen her, that we had spoken. But now there was nothing, no sign of her, no trace that she had ever been there. I hurried forward, looking around. But the park was empty, the trees rustling in the breeze, and everything seemed normal. The soft hum of the world carried on around me, unaffected, as though nothing had changed. I turned back to the bench, but it was just a bench, sitting quietly under the oak tree. There were no footprints, no discarded belongings. She was just gone. A cold chill ran down my spine as I stood there, confusion clouding my mind. Had I imagined it? Had I somehow created the whole moment in my head? It didn't make sense. It couldn't have been a dream. Not when I had seen her so clearly, heard her voice, felt the warmth of her smile. She had been there. But when I turned back to where she had stood, there was only the fading memory of her presence, like something too fragile to hold on to. I could feel the weight of that moment, heavy and unsettling, as if the entire encounter had been just a passing thought, something that couldn't be held on to, something that slipped through my fingers as soon as I tried to grasp it. I shook my head, trying to push the feeling away, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But as I walked away, the image of her smiling, waving goodbye remained with me, a memory that refused to fade. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been there for a reason. That moment, brief as it had been, felt too significant to ignore. I couldn't understand it, and yet a part of me knew she hadn't just been someone I knew from the past. She had been something I had to remember, and perhaps she had never truly been gone at all. It was late afternoon when I decided to take the long way home. I had just wrapped up another exhausting day at the office, the kind that left you drained, your mind cluttered with 1,000 little thoughts, none of them important. As usual, I pulled out my phone to check the map, planning the quickest route to my apartment just a few miles away. It was the same route I had taken countless times before. Nothing unusual, just the predictable path that had become second nature to me. But today, as I opened the map, something felt off. The streets on the map weren't lining up with what I saw in front of me. I glanced up at the road, then back at my phone, confused. My usual route, the one I always took, wasn't showing up the same way on the map. Instead, the streets seemed to stretch in directions I didn't recognize. A new street had appeared out of nowhere, winding its way through neighborhoods I knew well, but it wasn't a road I'd ever seen before. My heart skipped a beat. I checked the map again, zooming in to make sure I wasn't misreading it. But the streets were still shifting. The road I was standing on, the one that should have been there, was now gone. It was replaced by a series of smaller, unfamiliar streets, each one moving and changing as if the city was rearranging itself in real time. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe the map had glitched. Technology wasn't always perfect. But as I started walking down the street, I noticed something else. The buildings on either side of me didn't quite match the landmarks on the map. I couldn't place it exactly, but they felt wrong. They looked like they had been altered, their shapes not matching the way they should be. I had passed these streets countless times before. The corner store with the green awning, the coffee shop on the left, the tall apartment building on the corner, they were all there, but they felt somehow out of place. I stopped walking and stared at the screen again. The map had shifted once more, the streets twisting and turning in ways I couldn't comprehend. Roads that had always led straight ahead were now branching off, disappearing into nothingness. I zoomed in on the map, but no matter how much I zoomed or scrolled, it was the same. The streets were changing. Before my very eyes, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't normal. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I shook my head and tried to steady my breathing. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But the streets around me, they were shifting too. I turned down a side street that I was sure I had walked before. It was a shortcut I often used when I was in a hurry, leading to a quiet residential area. But as I walked, I realized something wasn't right. The street was longer than I remembered, stretching farther than it should. I checked the map again, but it didn't match. The road I was on had twisted in the map, turning into something entirely different. The landmarks, the buildings, they weren't matching up with what I was seeing. I kept walking, now more disoriented than ever, as if the city itself was becoming a maze, closing in on me. The further I walked, the more the streets seemed to change, folding in on themselves like a puzzle that refused to fit together. The houses, once familiar, now seemed unfamiliar, like they were part of a different version of the city. The trees along the sidewalk were too tall, the houses too close together, and yet they were the same streets, the same neighborhood. I pulled out my phone again and tried to follow the map more closely, but it was no use. The streets were changing faster now, too quickly for me to keep up. One moment I was walking past a block of houses, and the next, the street had turned into a narrow alleyway, completely different from the one on the map. The app was useless now, just a swirl of random lines that seemed to lead nowhere. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. But the more I tried to make sense of it, the more it felt like the city was shifting around me, warping and stretching in ways I couldn't explain. Every turn I made led to something new, something unfamiliar. I was walking in circles, my mind growing frantic as the streets stretched further and further into unknown territory. The feeling of being lost, completely and utterly lost, crept in slowly at first, then all at once. I looked up again, hoping for a familiar sight. But all I saw were buildings that didn't belong in this part of town, roads that didn't connect to each other in any logical way. I turned down another street hoping to find a way out, but the street kept going, longer than it should have been, winding around corners that didn't exist on the map. At this point, I didn't know what to think anymore. My phone was useless. The map a confusing blur of constantly shifting lines. The street lights above me flickered, and the noise of the city, the usual hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, seemed distant, muffled, as if I was walking through some kind of distortion. I finally stopped, standing in the middle of an intersection. I looked around, completely lost, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of an unsettling reality sink in. The city around me was changing, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend, and I was powerless to stop it. There was no familiar road back. There was no clear direction. The streets, the map, the city, they were all shifting before my eyes, becoming something unrecognizable. I stood there for a long time, staring at the street before me. The city, once so familiar, had become a maze, and I didn't know how to escape. I didn't know how to get back to the world I had once known. The map on my phone flickered once more, and as I watched, the streets shifted again, like the city had swallowed them whole. The lines blurred, twisted, and then disappeared. And I realized in that moment that the city wasn't changing around me. I was changing. It was a typical morning when I boarded the subway. The rush of commuters, the usual hum of the train, the faint scent of coffee and metal filling the air. I had taken this same train every day for months now, the same quiet ride through the city. The routine had become a comfort, predictable, safe, and simple. I was used to the crowded platforms, the gentle rocking of the car as it sped through the underground tunnels, and the brief moments of connection with the people around me, however fleeting. But today, something felt off from the start. I didn't notice it immediately, but as I stepped onto the train and found my usual spot near the door, I felt the air feel heavier, like the space around me was thickening, just a little. The train's lights flickered for a moment, casting long shadows across the seats. It wasn't anything unusual, just another day, right? But something about the flickering bothered me more than it should have. The train started moving, and I sank into my seat, trying to push away the odd sensation that was creeping up my spine. As the train sped through the city, I pulled out my phone and glanced at the time, tapping through the messages, trying to distract myself from the discomfort that was slowly building in my chest. I wasn't sure what it was, a slight unease, a feeling that I couldn't shake. And then the train made a stop. It wasn't a stop I recognized. I looked up, my eyes instinctively shifting toward the overhead map of stations, the brightly lit digital sign that was supposed to display the upcoming station names. But it was blank. The usual neon blue and white lights were gone, replaced by an empty static screen that flickered for a second and then returned to its void-like silence. The train doors slid open, and I could hear the faint hum of the station beyond, but nothing else. No voices, no footsteps, just silence. I stood up slowly, my heart beginning to race. The door to the platform opened, and I stepped off the train, moving cautiously toward the edge of the platform. The first thing that hit me was the smell, stale, musty air, as if this place hadn't been touched in years. The walls were old, cracked with the wear of time. The tiles were chipped, their once white surfaces now discolored and grimy. It looked like an abandoned station, forgotten by time itself. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it. The station was dim, lit by a few flickering lights overhead. I took a few tentative steps toward the edge of the platform, but there was no sign of anyone else. No other passengers, no station workers, just the endless silence of an empty place. I glanced up at the signs, expecting to see the name of the station, but it was blank. No name, no indication of where I was, just a sterile, hollow emptiness. The walls seemed to close in around me, the stillness pressing against my ears. I looked back at the train, still sitting there on the tracks, waiting for me. The doors were closed, the lights inside dim. For a moment, I considered getting back on. Maybe I had just missed my stop. Maybe this was just a strange glitch in the system. But there was something about the station, the air, the way it felt wrong in every possible way that kept me frozen in place. I turned away from the train, my legs suddenly feeling like lead. The further I walked down the platform, the more the station seemed to stretch, elongating in ways that didn't make sense. The tunnel ahead appeared to get darker, the end of it fading into an almost impenetrable blackness. I looked back at the train again, the blinking lights offering no comfort, no sign of life. It hadn't moved. It was still there, waiting. But where was everyone else? Why wasn't anyone else here? I moved farther into the station, my heart pounding louder with every step. The silence was unbearable now. I reached the end of the platform, where the stairs usually led up to the street level, but there was no staircase here. No exit. Just a solid wall, marked with faded signs I couldn't read. I ran my fingers over them, trying to decipher something, anything that could explain what I was seeing. Then I heard it. A distant sound, faint at first, barely audible like a soft humming coming from somewhere deep in the tunnel. It wasn't the sound of another train. It was something else. A low, unsettling hum, as if the entire station was vibrating, like something was buried beneath the layers of concrete and brick, waiting. I stepped back, my breath quickening, my mind racing with confusion and fear. I turned around, hoping to see the platform I had just walked through, the train that would take me home, but the station had changed. It was no longer the same. The walls, the tiles, the signs, they were all different, rearranged in a way that I couldn't comprehend. I turned back toward the tunnel. The humming sound was louder now, closer. I took a step forward, my body moving on its own, propelled by a strange curiosity, a pull I couldn't resist. I had to know what was making the sound. I had to understand what was happening. I walked deeper into the station, the humming getting louder, the darkness pressing closer. But then, something stopped me cold. The train I had just gotten off of, the one that had brought me here, was there. But it was no longer stationary. It was moving. It was backing up slowly, its lights flickering as if it had been there all along, waiting for me. And inside, I could see the faces of the passengers. Their eyes were all wide open, staring at me. No one blinked. No one moved. I turned away, my feet stumbling as I tried to run, but the tunnel was closing in, the walls bending toward me, the humming getting louder, echoing in my ears. I could feel it, the pull, the force that wanted me to stay. But I couldn't. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, but the more I ran, the further away the exit seemed. The station stretched endlessly, its dark walls closing in around me, the sound of the train's wheels rolling backward louder and louder until it drowned everything out. I don't know how long I ran, how many turns I took, but when I stopped, panting, my heart pounding in my chest, I found myself back at the platform. The train was gone. The station was still silent, empty. No sign of life. No sound except for the low hum, the one that seemed to be growing stronger with every passing second. I finally looked up at the digital map again, the one that had once been so familiar. The station I had crossed into, the one that had taken me here, it wasn't there. It didn't exist. I stood frozen on the platform, unsure of what to do next. The train I had come from was gone. The station was gone. And the only thing left was the humming, echoing beneath my feet, deeper and deeper, like it was calling me to stay. But I had to leave. The subway had taken me to a place that didn't exist, and I knew in that moment that there would be no way back. It was one of those quiet evenings where the world outside seemed to fade away, and all that remained was the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and the familiar silence of my apartment. The kind of evening that felt perfect for winding down after a long day. I had just finished dinner, and the only thing I wanted now was to relax. So I grabbed my book, the one I'd been reading for weeks, and sat down in front of the mirror to read, as I always did. There was something soothing about the reflection of the room around me, the soft light from the lamp casting a warm glow, and the quiet solitude that settled in as I read. I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. After all, I had spent countless evenings in front of that mirror, reading, thinking, sometimes even talking to myself about the day's events. But tonight it was different. It started with the feeling of someone watching me, though I was alone in the room. I glanced up from my book, the sensation too strong to ignore, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something strange in the mirror. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. My reflection, my face, was slightly different from what I knew. The corners of my mouth were curved into a smile, but it was wrong. It wasn't the smile I had on my face. It was something else, colder, more deliberate, as though someone else was controlling my reflection. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The room around me was the same. The walls, the furniture, the soft glow from the lamp, all untouched, all familiar. But my reflection, it was different. My eyes, which had been tired, were wide, almost unnaturally so, and the smile that tugged at my lips was too sharp, too knowing. It wasn't me. It couldn't be. I stood up, stepping closer to the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. I expected to see my reflection follow me, as it always did, but it didn't. The moment I moved, my reflection stayed still, locked in that strange, unsettling smile, its eyes staring back at me, unmoving, unnervingly calm. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me to look away, but I couldn't. It was as though the mirror had captured me, frozen me in place, and I was no longer in control. My reflection was staring at me, smiling, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then it happened. My reflection smiled at me. Not just any smile, but a smile full of something darker. A smile that didn't reach my eyes. A smile that felt like it was holding a secret I wasn't supposed to know. The reflection's eyes, wide and gleaming, locked with mine, and for a moment I could almost feel it. Like the reflection was aware of me, of everything that I was. It was as though it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to do something. I shook my head, backing away from the mirror, feeling the room close in around me. I turned to leave, to escape the growing sense of dread that was curling around my thoughts. But as I moved, I saw it again. The smile, the eyes, still locked on me, still watching. I ran out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, the feeling of being followed gnawing at my back. I stumbled into the hallway, my mind racing. How could it have happened? How could my reflection be separate? It wasn't possible. It wasn't real. But the longer I thought about it, the more certain I became. It was real. I had felt it. I had seen it. I couldn't escape it. I spent the rest of the evening in a haze, too afraid to look at the mirror again. I knew I had to. I knew I had to go back, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The feeling of being watched, the knowledge that my reflection was no longer a reflection of me, haunted me. I couldn't shake the thought that it had been left behind, waiting for me to return. I finally fell asleep that night, exhausted from the anxiety that had gripped me. But even in my sleep, I felt it. I felt the smile, the eyes, still locked on me, waiting for me to look again. The next morning, I gathered every ounce of courage I had left and went back to the mirror. I knew what I would see, but part of me hoped I was wrong, that it had all been a bad dream, a trick of my mind. But when I stood in front of it, there it was again, the reflection unchanged. I saw myself standing there looking back at me, but then I noticed it. The corner of my mouth just barely twitching upward, the smile. It was starting to form again, but this time it wasn't the reflection that smiled. It was me, my face. The reflection stayed behind. It stayed frozen, locked in that smile, while I moved toward the mirror. I wasn't in control anymore. The reflection was taking over. And I realized with a cold, sinking feeling that I had never been alone in that room. I never would be again. The reflection wasn't mine to command anymore. It had its own life. And it was waiting for me to join it. But this time I didn't think I would have the choice. It was a typical afternoon, the kind where the sun is just beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets. I was walking home from work, the weight of the day heavy on my shoulders. My thoughts wandering to the usual mundane things. What to eat for dinner, the plans I had for the weekend, the emails I needed to answer. The city I lived in had always felt alive, buzzing with movement, noise, and people. But today, something was different. Something felt off, though I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. I walked down the familiar street, past the park, and toward the bridge that spanned the river. The bridge had always been a part of my route home, a simple, unremarkable structure that connected the old part of town with the newer developments on the other side. I didn't even think about crossing it anymore. It had always been just a bridge. But today, as I approached the edge of the bridge, I felt a strange pull to stop. The air felt thicker somehow, like the atmosphere itself was pressing in on me, urging me to pay attention. The gentle sound of the river beneath the bridge, The usual flow of cars and pedestrians passing by was quieter than usual, as though muffled by something unseen. I hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped onto the bridge, the familiar pavement beneath my feet. The moment I crossed the threshold of the bridge, I felt a shift. It wasn't anything dramatic, not something you could point to and say, "That's where everything changed." But it was there, a subtle change in the air, the space around me. The city on the other side of the bridge, usually so vibrant and full of life, looked still. I took a few more steps forward, my heart picking up just slightly, an unease spreading through me. The bridge was old, sure, but this side of town always felt bustling, filled with people, street vendors, the noise of cars and chatter. But now, on this side of the bridge, there was no sound. No chatter, no horns blaring, no footsteps. Just the soft, almost oppressive quiet that hung in the air like a thick fog. As I walked further, I looked around. The streets were empty. The buildings, usually full of life, stood silent and still, their windows dark, the shops closed. The sidewalks were vacant. It felt like I had walked into a place that had been abandoned for years, even though I knew, just minutes ago, it had been a vibrant part of the city. I walked forward cautiously, my eyes scanning the surroundings. There was something unsettling about the silence, something wrong about the emptiness. I crossed an intersection and looked down the street. A row of shops, once bustling with people coming and going, stood abandoned. The windows were covered in grime, their signs faded, barely legible. The streetlights, which were always on, stood dim, their lights flickering intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked pavement. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't right. I had crossed this bridge 100 times, and every time this side of the city was as alive as the other. But now there was nothing. It was as though time itself had been erased from this place. I walked deeper into the city, my footsteps echoing louder than I expected. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, no life. The buildings were familiar, but they felt distant, hollow, as though they were empty shells, abandoned long ago. I turned a corner and saw an old cafe, the one I had passed countless times, but today its door was wide open. The interior was dark, save for a single flickering light bulb above the counter, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The tables were overturned, chairs scattered haphazardly across the floor, and there was a strange smell in the air, like something had decayed and been left to rot. I walked in cautiously, my eyes scanning the room. It looked like a place that had been abandoned in a hurry, as if everyone had left without a trace, without even locking the door behind them. I took another step inside, and then something caught my eye. At the back of the cafe on the wall, there was a clock. Its hands were frozen, stuck at exactly 3:12. The time didn't make sense. It felt wrong. I had crossed the bridge in the late afternoon, but this felt like the kind of stillness you'd find in a place that had long been forgotten. I quickly stepped back, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. The unease was growing, settling deep in my gut, like an ominous weight. I turned to leave, but as I stepped outside, I looked down the street again. It was the same as before, empty, silent. No one, not a single person. The cars were parked, but they were still, no one coming or going. I walked faster now, my footsteps hurried as I tried to make sense of what was happening. This side of the city was not supposed to be like this. The bridge had always been the line between the busy, active part of town and the quieter residential areas. But now it felt like the bridge had taken me to a different world entirely, a world that had been frozen in time, abandoned, as if the life that had once filled it had been wiped away in an instant. I reached the next intersection and stopped, staring at the buildings around me. There was no sound of life, no movement anywhere. The world was eerily still, as if this city had once been alive and thriving, but it had somehow stopped, as though it had been abandoned, forgotten. It was unsettling, like I had wandered into a memory that had lost its relevance. I turned back to look at the bridge, but it was no longer where I had crossed. The road in front of me was a straight path, but the bridge I had just walked across seemed to be missing. I blinked, confused. The buildings were still there. The streets were still familiar. But the bridge, the one I had crossed only moments ago, was gone, vanished, as though it had never existed in the first place. I walked back toward the street, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. I wasn't in the city I thought I had crossed into. This was a place that had been lost, left behind by time, and I had somehow stumbled into it. The world around me was empty, abandoned, and the more I tried to make sense of it, the more it felt like I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to have crossed that bridge. But there was no going back now. The city on the other side had disappeared, and the bridge that had connected it to the rest of the world was nowhere to be found. The only thing left was the silence, and the feeling that something important, had been lost forever. It was one of those mornings when the city felt alive, pulsing with energy. The usual hum of car engines, the chatter of people heading to work, and the sound of footsteps on wet pavement filled the air. I had just finished my early shift and was crossing the street to get to the bus stop. The rain had just stopped, leaving the air cool and crisp, the streets glistening under the soft glow of the streetlights. I didn't mind the quiet buzz of morning traffic. It was something comforting about it, the routine, the predictability. But something felt different today. As I walked toward the crosswalk, I noticed the traffic was a bit heavier than usual. Cars were backed up, the honking of horns filling the air, but the strange thing was, there was no movement. No one was going anywhere. It was as though everything had stopped. I paused for a moment, my eyes scanning the street, wondering why the cars weren't moving. The drivers weren't honking frantically or waving their hands in frustration. It was as if they had all come to an unspoken agreement to just stop. I waited at the curb expecting the traffic light to change, but it didn't. Time seemed to slow in that moment, the world stretching out in a way I couldn't quite grasp. The cars remained frozen in place, but the people inside weren't moving. Not a single head turned. No one was glancing at their watches or checking their phones. The stillness felt eerie. I took a step closer to the intersection, trying to figure out what was happening. Was there a traffic jam? An accident I hadn't seen? The usual bustling rhythm of the city felt utterly disrupted. But the longer I stood there, the more it struck me. The stillness wasn't just with the cars. It was everything around me. I stepped into the street, cautiously walking between the rows of motionless vehicles. The moment my foot touched the asphalt, I felt a sudden shift in the air. It wasn't anything obvious, not like the feeling of a breeze or a change in temperature. It was more like the world itself had tilted, just slightly, enough to make me question my place in it. The cars were still there, their engines silent, as though they had been paused mid-motion. But as I moved forward, I noticed something unsettling. The wheels of the cars were still slowly turning, ever so slightly, as if they were gliding across the pavement. It was the strangest thing. There was no sound, no hum of the engines. But the cars, every single one of them, was moving, very slowly but undeniably. It felt like I had stepped into another dimension, one where nothing made sense. I stopped, watching a red sedan inch forward, its tires rotating in perfect synchrony with the other cars, as if they were part of a strange, silent parade. The more I observed, the more I felt like the world was twisting around me. The cars weren't just moving, they were moving around me. It was as if I was the center of some cosmic stillness, and everything else was just a blur of motion, a background to my frozen state. I looked around, searching for some sign, some explanation, but there was nothing. The street was still packed with cars, the usual advertisements and storefronts lining the road, but it was all disconnected somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer in the same world I had been walking through just minutes before. I turned to glance down the street, and that's when I saw it. The people, the pedestrians who had been walking along the sidewalks, they weren't frozen like the cars. They were moving. But they weren't walking toward anything. They were simply moving in place. Their bodies were jerking, shifting, like they were stuck in some kind of loop, trapped in an endless walk. Some of them had stopped mid-step, their legs frozen in the air as if they were in a moment of perpetual motion. But the faces, their faces, all of them were blank. No expressions, no signs of frustration or confusion, just blankness, like they were unaware of anything happening around them. I took another step forward, my legs heavy with uncertainty, feeling as though I were crossing some invisible line between two worlds. The cars moved around me, drifting slowly past, their drivers locked in place, their eyes staring straight ahead. The pedestrians kept walking, their movements slow and uncoordinated. They didn't even seem to notice me. It was as though I had become a part of the scenery, a ghost in a world that had paused just long enough for me to become aware of it. I kept walking, feeling the pressure of the stillness pressing in from all sides, yet there was no escape. Every movement felt deliberate, but also futile. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from walking deeper into the scene. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long, jagged shadows on the pavement. I looked at the dark outlines of the buildings around me, trying to find something familiar, something that would ground me. But the world had shifted. The city I had known, the one I had walked through so many times before, felt alien now. The traffic didn't stop. The cars kept moving around me, never getting anywhere. The people continued their endless, looping walk. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that the world hadn't paused for me. It had paused for something else, something I couldn't understand. I stopped at the corner, my heart racing as I looked at the cars, the pedestrians, the street around me. But nothing made sense. Everything moved around me, but I was still. I was stuck in the center of it, watching, but unable to participate. It was like I was caught in a loop of my own, one where the world moved on without me. I turned and began walking away, my footsteps echoing on the empty street. The cars, the people, everything, it kept moving around me. I felt like I was in the eye of some storm, where time had stopped but the world refused to. And as I walked away, I realized that no matter how far I went, no matter where I turned, I would always be in the middle of it, stuck in a world where the traffic stopped, but the cars still moved around me. It was one of those rainy afternoons when everything seems to blur into a soft, monotonous haze. The kind of day where the sound of raindrops against the window feels like a lullaby, and the world outside seems distant, muffled, as though you're separated from it by a thin veil. I had just finished a long day of work, and the thought of a hot cup of coffee was the only thing pulling me from the fatigue that weighed on my body. The cafe was my usual spot, a small, cozy place tucked on the corner of a quiet street. It had always been comforting, with its warm, amber lighting, the scent of freshly ground coffee beans, and the soft hum of quiet conversations in the background. I stepped inside, shaking off the chill of the rain and pushing open the door with the familiar jingle of the bell overhead. The barista gave me a nod of recognition, and I made my way to the counter, smiling to myself as I glanced around. It was a typical late afternoon in the cafe, calm and unassuming, just like every other time I'd been here. But something felt wrong. I paused just for a second, standing by the entrance, scanning the room. The usual clink of cups, the murmur of voices, it was all there, but there was something in the air, a subtle tension that I couldn't place. I pushed it aside, chalking it up to exhaustion, and moved to the counter to order my coffee. As I turned to face the room again, my breath caught in my throat. Everyone, every single person in the cafe, seated at the tables, standing by the window, they all looked at me. And they were wearing my face. It wasn't the kind of thing where I could convince myself I was imagining it. No, it was unmistakable. Every person in the room, whether it was the woman reading a book in the corner, the man tapping away on his laptop, the couple sharing a quiet conversation at the window, they all had the same face. My face. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same expression. It was me, and yet it wasn't. My heart began to race. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but it didn't help. I rubbed my eyes, willing the image to change. But when I opened them again, nothing had shifted. The same people, the same faces. All of them were mirrors of me, each one staring at me with that blank, emotionless expression that I was sure mirrored my own. I could feel my skin grow cold. The room seemed to close in around me, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. I tried to make my way to the barista, hoping I could find some normalcy, but my legs felt heavy as though they were made of stone. It wasn't like I could ask what was happening. It didn't make any sense. The world didn't make sense. I took a hesitant step toward the counter, my feet moving as if they had their own mind, but the people, my replicas, didn't look away. They didn't say a word. They just sat there silent and still, watching me. I felt the weight of their gaze on my back, pressing down on me like invisible hands. I stopped in front of the counter, unsure of what to do. The barista, the one who always smiled at me when I came in, stood there looking at me. Her expression was unreadable, but the thing that stood out, the thing that froze me in place, was that her face, was the same as mine too. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't even know what I was supposed to say. Was this some kind of joke? Was I being pranked? But as I looked around the room again, I realized it wasn't a joke. This wasn't a game. This wasn't something I could laugh off. The weight of their eyes, my eyes, was suffocating. I could feel my hands trembling as I reached out for my coffee cup. My reflection stared back at me from the shiny surface of the counter, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw it move, just slightly. But when I looked closer, it was still. I glanced back at the others. The woman by the window, the man in the corner, even the old man with the cane sitting quietly at his table. They were all me. It was like I had walked into a mirror and found the reflection distorted into dozens of versions of myself. I had to leave. I had to get out. I stepped back from the counter, my breath shallow, my mind racing. But before I could turn, I heard it. A voice calm and familiar, but not mine. "You shouldn't leave." I froze. The voice. It was coming from the woman who had been reading in the corner, the one whose face was mine. She was standing now, looking directly at me. Her expression was still blank, but there was something in her eyes, something that chilled me to the bone. "You belong here," she said again, her voice as emotionless as everything else around me. My heart was pounding now, and I had to get out of there. I turned quickly, pushing past the others, not daring to look at them, my body trembling with each step. I reached the door and pulled it open, desperate for the cool night air, for the real world to come crashing back. But as I stepped into the street, I felt it. The air outside was different. It wasn't fresh, it wasn't clean. It was thick, heavy, like I was suffocating. I turned around, expecting to see the street, the familiar buildings of the neighborhood. But instead, all I saw was the cafe. The same cafe standing there in front of me as if I had never left. I blinked. I looked around, confused, heart racing. No, this couldn't be happening. I had just walked out. I had just stepped outside. I turned to look behind me, and there they were again. The people, all of them, sitting in their usual spots. My face staring back at me, watching, waiting. The door behind me shut with a soft click, and I turned around slowly, my body trembling. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what any of this meant, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to find an answer here. I turned and ran down the street, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't running away from the cafe. I was running toward it, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I moved, it would always be waiting for me. I had just finished my shift at the cafe and was walking down the usual path to the bus stop. The streets were quiet, as they always were at this hour, with the hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was a familiar walk, one that didn't require much thought. The path was simple, the same every day, and I liked it that way. The world felt safer when it didn't change. The weather had been overcast all day, and the evening was no different. The sky was thick with clouds, and a chill hung in the air, as if the world were waiting for something. I tucked my scarf tighter around my neck and pushed my hands deeper into my pockets, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling that had settled into my chest. Maybe it was just the long day, but something about the night felt off. It was as if the usual hum of the city had turned to static, buzzing just below the surface. I turned a corner, walking down the side street that led to the bus stop, and that's when I saw her. She was standing there, just ahead of me, at the mouth of an alleyway that I had never noticed before. Her figure was tall and thin, her dark coat blending into the shadows. The street lamp above flickered, casting an erratic light on her face, but I couldn't make out her features, not clearly enough to recognize her. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, facing me with an odd stillness about her. Then, after a long moment, she lifted her hand and pointed towards the alley, as if signaling that I should go that way. I stopped, surprised, feeling a surge of confusion. There was something off about the way she moved, too deliberate, too knowing. It was as if she had been waiting for me. Without a word, I followed her gesture, my eyes moving towards the alley she had pointed to. The alley seemed ordinary at first glance, just a narrow space between two buildings. But as I looked closer, a strange sensation crawled up my spine. It was as though the alley didn't quite belong there. The walls on either side were worn, faded with age, and there was something about the shadows that didn't look right. They were darker than they should have been, thicker, like they were pulling the light into themselves. I glanced back at the woman, expecting her to be gone, but she was still standing there, her hand still pointed towards the alley. There was no expression on her face, just a cold, unreadable look, and I couldn't help but feel that something important was about to happen. I didn't know why, but something told me that I had to walk down that alley. I had to see where it led. I took a step forward, the sounds of my footsteps echoing in the quiet street. The closer I got to the alley, the more the world seemed to quiet down, as though the very air was thickening around me. I reached the entrance, and as I looked down the alley, my breath caught. It was different. The buildings on either side, which had looked so familiar just moments ago, now appeared warped, as though they were twisting inward, like the very space itself was bending. The alley stretched out before me, but there was no way to tell how far it went, no end in sight. It felt like it should have been there, but it wasn't. I took another step, feeling an unexplainable pull, like the alley was calling to me. But then, just as I was about to step into the darkness, something strange happened. The alley disappeared. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, replaced by an empty space where it should have been. I stood frozen, staring at the place where the alley had been. The buildings on either side, which had been so close together moments ago, now seemed impossibly far apart, and the ground beneath my feet was nothing but bare, cold pavement. The shadows that had once stretched so thick were gone, replaced by a strange, hollow emptiness. I stepped back, my mind reeling, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, but the street was unchanged. The woman who had pointed to the alley was gone too, vanished without a trace, leaving only the empty street behind. I turned around, hoping to see her standing there, but the street was empty. The same quiet, lonely street I had walked down every night now seemed endless, stretching on and on with no sign of anyone. I felt dizzy, like the ground beneath me wasn't solid anymore. The alley had been right there, I was sure of it. But now it was gone, like it had never existed at all. I stood there unsure of what to do. My mind kept racing, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? But it didn't feel like that. It felt real. I had seen the alley. I had seen the woman. She had pointed to it, and I had felt that strange, compelling urge to walk down it. But now, it was like it had never been there at all. The world felt different now, as if the rules of reality had shifted, just for a moment. I turned around and started walking, my pace quickening. I needed to get home. I needed to get out of this strange, empty street. But as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That alley, that woman, the pull I had felt to follow her, none of it made sense, and yet I couldn't forget it. And as I walked, I glanced down side streets, around corners, and at the shadows in the alleyways, hoping that I wouldn't see her again, hoping I wouldn't see that alley. But I knew deep down that if I ever did see it again, it wouldn't lead me where I thought it would. It would lead me somewhere I couldn't understand, and that thought made my skin crawl. I never walked that way again. But I've often wondered, if I had, would the alley have appeared again? Would it have vanished once more? Or was there something else waiting for me down that path? Something I was never meant to find. It was late, and the night air felt unusually still. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something, though I couldn't quite figure out what. I had just finished a long day, and the walk home was supposed to be a simple, mindless routine. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that made it feel like I was the only person awake in the world. I didn't mind, though. I enjoyed the solitude. It gave me time to think, time to let my mind wander, to lose myself in the rhythmic shuffle of my footsteps against the sidewalk. The streetlights above me flickered in the distance, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched out across the pavement like fingers reaching for me. As I walked, I paid no attention to the occasional light that seemed to flicker out, only to return a few moments later. It was just another quirk of the neighborhood. Or at least I thought it was. But as I continued, something felt off. The air seemed heavier, the silence more pronounced. I couldn't quite place it, but it was as though the world was slowly closing in around me. My pace quickened, my steps becoming more hurried. I tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch. I was still a few blocks from home when I noticed the first strange thing: the streetlights ahead of me. They were flickering in a pattern, each one turning off and on in quick succession, almost as if they were trying to send me a signal. I slowed down, watching them, unsure of what I was seeing. The lights weren't following any kind of normal pattern. They blinked at odd intervals, and there was something unsettling about their randomness. I had always taken this route home. It was a path I knew well, but as I walked, I realized that something had changed. The street seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. The familiar houses, the trees that lined the sidewalk, everything was still there, but they felt wrong. As if they had been distorted in some way, subtly altered, just enough to make me second-guess my surroundings. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of unease creeping into my thoughts. Maybe I was just tired, too wrapped up in my own mind. I took another step forward, determined to push through the discomfort, but as I did, the strangest thing happened. The streetlights ahead of me, the same ones I had just been watching, seemed to be farther away. They flickered again, and I stopped in my tracks. No, I must have misjudged the distance. I had been walking straight down the road, right? I took another step, but as I did, the lights grew even farther away, the gap between them widening. It was as if I hadn't moved at all. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to look behind me, expecting to see the same row of streetlights, but when I did, I found only the empty stretch of road I had walked down moments ago. I felt my stomach tighten with a cold, creeping sense of dread. This wasn't normal. I wasn't imagining it. The street I knew so well, the one I walked every day, had shifted somehow. The familiar path was no longer there, replaced by something strange, something unfamiliar. I turned back toward the streetlights, and this time, I moved toward them with purpose, hoping to break the eerie sense that I was trapped in some sort of loop. But as I walked, I noticed something even stranger. The streetlights, which had once been spaced evenly apart, were now positioned differently, much farther apart, as though the very layout of the street had changed. I pushed forward, determined to reach them, but the closer I got, the further away they seemed to be. No matter how many steps I took, I could never seem to reach the next one. I began to walk faster, my breath quickening, my pulse thudding in my chest. The air felt thick, pressing in on me, and with each passing moment, the streets seemed to stretch farther, twisting back on themselves. The familiar landmarks, the trees, the houses, blurred, and the path ahead looked indistinguishable from the one behind me. I stopped. My mind raced, spinning with confusion. Had I taken a wrong turn? Had I somehow walked in a circle? No, that couldn't be right. I knew this street. I knew this route. But as I turned to look behind me again, I saw that the streetlights had already moved. They weren't where they should have been, and the road behind me looked like a version of the street I didn't recognize. I was lost. I had no idea how I had gotten here, but the worst part was, I didn't know how to get back. I tried to retrace my steps, but the more I tried, the further away everything seemed to get. The houses blurred together, the road curved in unnatural ways, and the lights continued to flicker, mocking me with their deliberate, erratic pattern. The world around me had warped, bent, and now I was trapped in it. The streetlights blinked again, one after another, their faint glow casting long shadows that twisted and flickered on the ground. It was as if they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand what. I continued walking, my footsteps growing louder in the silence. My breath was shallow, and my chest tightened with every step. I kept my eyes on the streetlights, hoping they would lead me somewhere familiar. But no matter how far I walked, they led me in circles. Over and over again, I passed the same corner, the same streetlights, the same stretch of road. Each time they seemed further away, until eventually the lights flickered out entirely, leaving me in absolute darkness. The silence was suffocating. I tried to shout, but my voice was swallowed by the heavy night air. There was no one around, no sound, nothing but the stillness of the street that had turned into a labyrinth of confusion and fear. I didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like hours, or maybe days. Finally, I stopped. I stood still in the middle of the street, heart racing, mind spinning with the realization that I would never reach the end of this road. The streetlights had tricked me, leading me in endless circles, and I had become nothing more than a part of their cycle. I looked up at the dark sky, and for the first time I noticed something strange. The stars were missing, and the moon, once full and bright, had disappeared. There was no light now, only the endless blackness that surrounded me. I was trapped, and no matter which way I turned, the streetlights would always lead me in a circle. It was late, and the only sound filling the air was the soft patter of rain against the window. I had just returned from a long day of work, and the quiet of the house seemed to welcome me like an old friend. My apartment was small, tucked away on the upper floor of an old building that had seen better days. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the creaky floorboards added to the charm, or so I like to tell myself. It was a place that felt familiar, like home. Yet, lately I had started to feel as though there was something wrong. Subtle at first, small things that didn't quite add up, but as time passed, they started to grow harder to ignore. I had just finished putting my bag down and settling in when I heard it. A faint noise, almost imperceptible at first, coming from the hallway. A soft creak like a door opening, but I hadn't heard anyone approach. I froze for a moment, wondering if I was hearing things. It was strange. This building was usually so quiet, and I was certain I had locked every door before I came inside. But there it was again, a creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. I stood up, my heart already pounding, and slowly walked toward the hallway. The dim light from the living room barely reached the end of the corridor, and as I reached the hallway, I saw it. The door to my bedroom, which I had definitely closed when I came in, was now ajar, just slightly. I took a step toward it, my pulse quickening, and as I reached out to push it fully open, I felt something cold brush against my fingers. It was as if the air around the door had suddenly grown heavy, thick with an unsettling tension. When I opened the door, expecting to find nothing out of the ordinary, I was wrong. What lay beyond was not the familiar sight of my bedroom at all. Instead, it was a hallway. Long, narrow, and shrouded in a strange, pale light that didn't seem to come from anywhere in particular. The walls were a dull gray, smooth but somehow wrong, like they didn't belong in this world. The air was thick, heavy with an almost tangible stillness that made my throat tighten. I stood frozen in place for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The hallway stretched on, far longer than any hallway in my apartment should have been. It was as if the very dimensions of the building had changed, morphing into something foreign, something unrecognizable. The floor beneath my feet was different, too. An old, worn carpet, but not the one I had in my room. This was a faded red, threadbare, with patches of darker stains that seemed to pulse faintly, as if they had a life of their own. I took a tentative step forward, my foot making a soft thud against the carpet. The hallway stretched out before me, and I could just make out the faint outlines of doors on either side, their shapes indistinct in the low, otherworldly light. My breath caught in my throat as I wondered if I was imagining all of this. If maybe I had fallen asleep and this was some strange, vivid dream. But the cold, unsettling air told me otherwise. As I stepped deeper into the hallway, I noticed something strange. The farther I walked, the more the hallway seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. I couldn't see where it ended, couldn't see any clear point in the distance where the hallway would lead me. It just went on, and with every step, it felt like the space around me was closing in, like the walls were slowly creeping inward, pressing against my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. I couldn't stop myself. I continued to move forward, though my instincts screamed at me to turn around, to run back to the safety of my apartment, to lock the door behind me and pretend I had never seen this strange, impossible place. But the allure of the hallway, the strange, unshakable feeling that I had to keep going, pushed me forward. I passed several doors on either side, each one slightly ajar, as though they had been left waiting for me. I didn't dare open them, too afraid of what I might find. But then, near the end of the hallway, I saw something that made my stomach drop. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow maybe, but as I stepped closer I realized it was unmistakably real, a figure, standing perfectly still in the shadows, just at the farthest point of the hallway. The figure was tall, indistinct, cloaked in darkness, but I could feel its presence. It didn't move, but its stillness was somehow more terrifying than any movement could have been. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure hadn't seen me, not yet, but I could feel its gaze on me like it was aware of my every movement. I wanted to scream, to turn and run back to the safety of my apartment, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my body frozen in place as if some invisible force was holding me there, compelling me to stay. And then, just as I was about to turn and flee, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped into the pale light of the hallway. I could see now that it was wearing a long, dark cloak, the hood drawn low over its face. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, like it wasn't quite human. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized that whatever it wasn't something I should be seeing, something I wasn't meant to encounter. I took a step back, my breath shallow, my mind racing, but the figure didn't advance. Instead, it simply stood there, staring at me, its presence growing more and more oppressive with each passing second. I could hear the faintest sound now, a whisper, low and unintelligible, like the rustling of paper or the sound of wind through dry leaves. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, stumbling over the carpet, my feet moving faster than my mind could process. The hallway seemed to stretch out farther and farther as I ran, the figure's shadow growing larger in my peripheral vision. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't seem to get any closer to the end of the hallway. I finally reached the door, the one I had come through, and as I flung it open, I expected to find my apartment again. The familiar walls, the soft glow of the light, the peaceful silence. But when I looked through the door, I didn't see the apartment. I saw the hallway, the same pale light, the same distant doors, and the same oppressive, choking silence. It had followed me back. It had been waiting for me. I slammed the door shut, my heart hammering in my chest. I backed away slowly, my mind racing, but when I looked back to where the door should have been, I saw it, the shadow of the figure, still lingering in the corner of my vision. It was watching me, waiting, and then I realized something far more terrifying than the shadow itself. The door had never closed. It hadn't led me back to my apartment. It had led me somewhere else, somewhere I would never escape from. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavier than usual, damp and thick, with the scent of rain that hadn't quite fallen yet. I was walking home from the bus stop, not particularly in a hurry, just letting my thoughts drift aimlessly like the wind through the trees. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels almost too still, like something was waiting for a moment to break the silence. I was on the main street, the one that always seemed to stretch longer than I remembered, when I noticed her. She was standing just at the corner, right where the street turned into a narrow, less familiar part of the neighborhood. She looked out of place, her figure draped in an oversized dark coat, the hood pulled low over her face, though I could still make out the faint glint of her eyes, distant and unreadable. She was just standing there, not moving, but somehow I knew she was waiting for someone, and I guessed that someone was me. I slowed my pace, unsure why, but somehow drawn to her. Something in the way she stood, so calm and still in the middle of the quiet night, felt oddly familiar. As I got closer, she lifted her head slightly, just enough to glance at me, and without a word, she began to walk. I hesitated for a second, but then, almost instinctively, I followed her. There was a strange kind of pull to her, something magnetic that made me want to keep walking beside her. She led me down the street, one I had taken countless times before, but tonight it felt different. The houses looked different, more distant and shadowed, as though they were retreating into the mist that seemed to rise from the ground. I could hear the distant hum of traffic behind me, but it sounded muffled, as though the world was being slowly erased. She walked without looking back, her pace steady and deliberate. I kept my steps in time with hers, unsure of what I was doing, but feeling a strange sense of trust. The street we were walking on twisted and turned, as if she was guiding me through a maze I hadn't known existed. Each corner we passed seemed to blur into the next, until I could no longer tell where I was. There were no streetlights now, and the houses had disappeared completely. All that surrounded us was a thick, suffocating darkness, and then the trees. Tall, twisted trees that seemed to emerge from nowhere, their branches reaching out like long fingers. I stopped walking, feeling an unfamiliar chill crawl down my spine. The woman didn't notice my hesitation. She just kept moving forward, as if the darkness, the trees, and the strange absence of anything familiar were normal. "Where are we going?" I finally asked, my voice sounding foreign in the still night air. She didn't answer, not directly, but with a slight nod toward the woods ahead. I felt a surge of unease, but something in me, some strange instinct maybe, told me to keep going. Maybe it was the way she walked, so certain, so sure of where she was headed. I followed her, one foot after another through the trees. The air grew colder with each step, and I noticed that the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees towering above us, blocking out what little light there was. It felt like I was walking deeper into a place I had never seen before. Yet it was so familiar, like a dream I couldn't quite remember. The path we were on was narrow, barely more than a trail, and as we moved farther in, the silence deepened. No animals, no insects, just an eerie stillness that wrapped itself around me, making my skin crawl. I wanted to ask her again where we were going, but the words caught in my throat, as if the forest itself had a way of silencing me. I tried to shake the unease that had begun to rise in my chest, but it was hard. The deeper we went, the stranger everything seemed. And then there it was, a clearing. A small patch of open ground surrounded by trees so tall they seemed to touch the sky. In the center of the clearing was a small, weathered cabin, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar. The moment I saw it, a wave of familiarity rushed over me, but it wasn't the good kind. It was the kind of familiarity that made your stomach twist with dread, like you had seen it before in a dream or a nightmare. But it couldn't be real. I had never been here, not consciously. The woman paused at the edge of the clearing, and for the first time since I'd started following her, she turned to look at me. Her face was still hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel her eyes on me. The look in her eyes wasn't one of kindness or warmth, but something far colder, as if she was waiting for something, expecting something. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond at first, and for a long moment she simply stood there, watching me. And then finally she spoke, her voice low and steady. "It's where the path ends." I stared at her, confused, not understanding what she meant. She turned back to the cabin, her footsteps silent on the forest floor. I stood there for a long moment, torn between fear and the overwhelming curiosity that had driven me this far. I had no idea how I had ended up in this forest or why I felt like I had been here before. But something in the air told me that the cabin held an answer, or perhaps more questions. And so, with hesitation creeping up my spine, I followed her toward the cabin. As we approached, I could hear the faintest sound, a whisper, barely audible. It wasn't the wind or the trees, but something else. A voice. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked around, expecting to see someone else in the clearing. But there was no one. Only the woman, her back to me as she stepped closer to the door. I stopped just short of the threshold, the whisper growing louder, more insistent. I stepped back, but then the door creaked open, just enough to let a sliver of light spill out into the darkness. My eyes locked onto the faint glow from inside the cabin, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the doorway. A person, perhaps, or something else. I couldn't tell. The woman was gone. The door to the cabin was wide open now, as if waiting for me to step inside. I didn't want to go any further. But as I stood there, staring into the cabin, I realized something. I knew this place. I had been here before, and I was being pulled back. The whispering continued, louder now, filling the air around me. And as I turned to run, I found myself standing at the edge of the street again. The street where it had all started. The rain had begun to fall, and everything seemed just as it had been hours ago. But the question lingered in my mind unanswered. Was it real? Was it a dream? Or had the forest brought me home? It was one of those gray days when the sky is so thick with clouds that it feels as though the world has been swallowed up by a fog that never quite lifts. The kind of day where the air feels heavy and every footstep echoes more than usual. I was walking home from work, my usual route, the path I had taken hundreds of times before without a single second thought. The streets were nearly empty, just the faint hum of distant cars and the rhythmic tapping of rain on the pavement. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels strange and unsettling, like the world is holding its breath. As I approached the familiar corner, I noticed something off. The building that stood at the end of the street, a narrow old brick structure with a faded sign that had long lost its legibility, was gone. It wasn't just that it was missing, it was as if it had never been there at all. The spot where it should have been was empty, and the sidewalk that once led to the entrance now stretched forward into a plain, unbroken stretch of pavement, like a missing memory. I stopped, unsure of what I was seeing, my heart suddenly pounding against my chest. I blinked a few times, convinced it was a trick of the rain or the light, but no matter how many times I looked, the corner was bare. I shook my head, muttering to myself that I must have been more tired than I thought. I carried on walking, my pace quickening slightly, trying to push the unease from my mind. But as I rounded the corner, I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. I glanced over my shoulder almost instinctively and saw the empty space once again. The air seemed colder now, and I felt a strange shiver crawl up my spine. It was as if I had stepped into a different version of reality, one where the building never existed. By the time I reached the next block, my mind was racing. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was probably just some construction work I hadn't noticed. I could have sworn I'd seen the building just the day before, or was it 2 days ago? It was a regular part of my daily walk after all. Yet the more I thought about it, the more I began to question everything. I decided to turn around and retrace my steps, hoping that seeing the corner again would somehow make it feel real again, would help me put the creeping discomfort to rest. I made my way back, the rain now heavier, falling in sheets as though the sky was pouring itself out. The air smelled different, like wet concrete and something else, something faintly metallic. I was almost back to the corner when I noticed it again. The building was still gone. The empty space stared back at me like a wound in the world, and my breath caught in my throat. It was as if time itself had decided to skip a beat. I stood there for a long moment, my heart thudding so loudly I was sure anyone passing by could hear it. I didn't move. I didn't want to move. I was afraid to blink, as though doing so might make everything disappear entirely. The rain wasn't letting up, but the silence around me felt unnatural. No cars, no distant chatter, just the drumming of rain on the pavement. I turned to walk again, but then, just as I took a step, I heard it, the softest of whispers. It wasn't from anywhere in particular, but it felt like it was coming from the empty space where the building had been. I froze. My breath caught again. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something in the sound, something familiar. I turned quickly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but of course, there was no one. Only the stillness, the rain, and that strange emptiness. The corner felt more oppressive now, as though it had been waiting for me. I decided to leave. My mind was reeling, my pulse racing. I had to get home. As I turned around to leave, I stole one last glance back, just to check, just to see if it was there. But when I did, I saw it. The faint outline of the building, just barely visible, as if it were beginning to take shape again. The edges were blurry, like something you can only half remember. I blinked rapidly, convinced I was seeing things. But when I opened my eyes again, the building was back in full view, as though it had never left. The same faded sign, the same crumbling bricks, the same tired windows. I stood frozen, staring at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. I turned to walk away again, only to find myself at the same corner, the same empty spot. It was as though I was caught in some strange loop, walking past the same corner, only to be met with the same absence. I felt a sudden wave of dizziness, as if the world was shifting beneath my feet, like I was walking on air, on the edge of reality itself. I shook my head hard, willing myself to leave, but when I glanced up again, the building was gone. Completely gone. Not even the outline remained. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and I could feel my body shaking now, my thoughts spiraling. I tried to call out, but the words caught in my throat, suffocated by the silence that seemed to press in on me. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. And then, just as I was about to give up on trying to make sense of it, I felt something cold, a hand or something like it, brush the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing. Only the rain, the silence, and the empty street. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled backward away from the corner. I couldn't stand there any longer. I turned and ran, my footsteps slapping against the wet pavement as the rain poured down harder. I never went back to that street, and I can't help but wonder, was it all just a trick of the mind? Or was there something more? Every time I walk down a street now, I find myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the empty space or the building, or something else entirely. But it's been years now, and I still can't shake the feeling that at that corner, something or someone is waiting.